nor yet could have access to propagate his heresies in the western shires, where most of our friends had their residence, though they and we both have been most inquisitously reproached herewith, being discovered by many, particularly by Mr. Cargill, whose ministry he rejected. Yet his foresaid followers did go a great way with him, as they have with remorse resented since in their confessions, being through mercy reclaimed, partly by Mr. Cargill's writing to them, and partly by their own discoveries of him, did not forsake him, till after his execrable cursing of the ministers and others not of his way. Being incarcerated, he put forth a blasphemous paper, not only condemning all the work of Reformation, but also the English Bible in the form as it is now extant, as a human invention, and containing many other abominations, in all which he pleased the Duke of York, and received extraordinary favours from him, and thereafter, being freely let go, he proceeded to that height of profanity and contempt of God that he burnt the Bible and belched forth many other blasphemies, which would be offensive to Christian ears to rehearse. Again, in some process of time, James Russell discovered some unwarrantable excesses, pressing in different things as the most necessary duties, as about naming the days of the week and months of the year, etc., and otherwise imposing upon men's consciences, whereupon he and we parted, after which he branded and aspersed us with false charges, as if we had turned aside to gross defections, and palliated and plastered the corruptions of our time, comforting in this with some few, and even with some who had given little satisfying resentment of their former extravagancies with Gibb, being by them applauded and strengthened in his foresaid excesses. In the meanwhile, there was no public testimony by preaching kept up, by reason of that sad sleep of dark and deep silence into which ministers had fallen, which occasioned very lamentable confusions, so that one could not understand the language of another, in the face of affairs being so obscured, and matters looking so hopeless and helpless like. Yet it pleased the Lord by a poor contemptible handful to convey down the testimony by publishing another declaration at Lanark, January 12, 1682, confirming the preceding at Sandwar, in its disowning the interest of the tyrant and bearing testimony against the immediately foregoing pretended Parliament where James Duke of York did preside as commissioner, and in particular against the abominable test framed by them. But as the former was much condemned, so also this, even because of its coming from us and confirming Sandwar declaration, as said is. From thenceforth many did more plainly and positively oppose us, as if we had turned aside to some erroneous and unhappy course. And thus they proceeded to inform against us, both at home and abroad, as such, without trying, whether or not we maintained such things as were laid to our charge, and taking pains to admonish us as being watchmen, especially when they apprehended people to be drawn aside with errors. For surely it was never yet heard that an erring people, if we had been, as they informed against us, were reclaimed by such means as they used. However, the Lord, who is not wanting to provide means for the strengthening and encouraging of his people, even then, when we were few in number, without the concurrence of pastors and scattered abroad, not well knowing the minds of one another, nor who concurred with us through the land, in the foresaid part of our testimony, did make some instrumental, immediately before the publication of the Lanark Declaration, to gather us together in a general correspondence, which we have hitherto, by the Lord's providence, kept up, both through the shires severally, and all the shires conjunctly, where such as owned our testimony did reside, whereby we attained to better understanding of one another, and were put in capacity to contribute more to our mutual advantage. Whence it came to pass, that being thus jointly and harmoniously knit together, we began, after the publication of the foresaid declaration at Lanark, in the next general meeting or correspondence, to deliberate about some method whereby our broken and low case might be represented and made known to strangers, not that we might carry on a faction or separation from the Scottish true Presbyterian Church, as we were misrepresented, but that we might declare our adherence to the principles thereof. Hereupon it was resolved, and thought fit, that some of our number should be particularly sent, both to the other covenanted and foreign churches, to make known our broken and low case to them, to wipe off reproaches that were cast upon us, to represent the justness of our cause, and that we might see what help thereby might be made unto us. After which, by the special providence of God, a door being opened for the instruction of some students at a college in the Netherlands, We sent thither some young men unto their studies, not to become a reproach to the Scottish Church, as some say, but to be instructed in theology, that so they might be in better capacity to keep up the testimony of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to our Covenanted Reformation. Whereupon, in some process of time, we received back Mr. James Rennick, an ordained minister, whose labours God hath blessed with fruit and increase to the praise of grace. Hereafter, while we continued to keep up our general meetings and correspondences, and also endeavoured to contribute what aid we could in our places and stations to uphold the banner of the gospel, the persecutors' fury did rage against us in a very great measure, in putting out cruel acts and laws for all subjects to apprehend, or cause apprehend us, wherever we might be found, and raise the hue and cry after us. Also inhibiting all to reset us, or correspond any manner of way with us, under the hazard and pain of being liable to the same rigor of their laws that we ourselves were. Whereupon many of us being taken and killed, and very many banished and sent to be sold as slaves, while we could not escape falling into their hands in great numbers, partly by their vigilance and diligence, and partly through the information and intelligence that they got from many in the country where we wandered, we were then necessitated to put forth another declaration, November 1684, which was affixed upon some market crosses and several parish church doors, to deter and scar the country from giving intelligence of us, and also explain the latter part of the foresaid declaration at San Juan, concerning the declaring of war against the tyrant and his accomplices, and to wipe off that most odious and false calumny of being in the judgment to kill all who were not of our own opinion. Which declaration, though many cried out against it, yet was not condemned by so many as the former, and though it was the occasion of a greater trial to the people of the land than any formerly, because the enemies pressed an oath for abjuring the same, so violently and generally, and with such a fair and lying face, that many yielded to it, some ministers taking it, and others pleading for it. But as the Lord had many in the land bearing testimony against the foresaid abjuration, some of them even unto death, of divers who had complied with it, expressed afterward great sorrow and remorse for that deed. Yet the foresaid declaration was so far effectual as to deter many from their former diligence in informing against us, and also to draw out some to join with us and own the work more publicly in their places and stations than before this they had done. But in the meantime, when they were persecuting us so hotly, their soldiers and some gentlemen killing us whenever we could be found, without either trial or sentence, before any of their so-called judicatories, and when they were holding their courts concerning the abjuring of that same declaration, the Lord did remove by death that tyrant Charles II, whereupon instantly followed the proclaiming of James, Duke of York, a professed and known papist, and avowed enemy to God and godliness, by a party of his own creatures, as King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. And afterwards his convocating a parliament in Scotland to authorize and confirm the foresaid proclamation, and to establish him in his usurpation and tyranny. Therefore we thought that such a deed could not pass without some witness and testimony against the same by us, unless we had forgotten the method of our worthy, zealous, and resolute reformers, and our solemn bonds and covenants to the Lord, and also his great kindness shown unto us in preserving a remnant of us in this hot, fiery furnace. Hence we published another declaration at San Juan, May 28, 1685, testifying against the foresaid proclamation, and protesting against the then pretended Parliament convocate by him to establish his tyranny and carry on his other designs, and also bearing witness and testimony against all kind of papistry, in general and particular heads, as is fully expressed in our national covenant, against its entering into this land again, which he and his accomplices were clearly seen to be driving at before, at that time, and much more since, and against anything which might make way for the same, etc. Which declaration, as it was not so much condemned by others as any of our former, so enemies were so far restrained by God, and diverted by other means, of present occurring exigencies, that it never as yet became any trial to the land. This was done in the meantime of the Earl of Argyll's expedition, with which we were much pressed to concur, and several embodied with us were drawn away with the with the importunity of some ministers and others of that association. Yet we could not join with them nor espouse their declaration as the state of our quarrel, because it was not concerted according to the ancient plea of the Scottish Covenanters in defense of our Reformation, expressly according to our covenants, national and solemn league, of which they made no mention in their declaration, nor of presbyterial government, which was of purpose lest the sectarians should be irritated, and because it opened a door for a confederacy with sectarians and malignants, of which malignants they had some among them guilty of shedding our blood at Erasmus. After the defeat of this expedition, in answer to the desire of some ministers who came over with the foresaid Earl, at least it was reported to us they desired such a thing, we had a conference with them July 22nd, 1685, in which, instead of allaying differences, the proposals that were made for union did heighten our breaches, both with them and among ourselves, as did appear by the consequence. For herein, though they offered accommodation, yet in conference to bring it about, they maintained and did not disown that which bred alienation, that is, quote, previous information they had sent to strangers, accusing us of heavy things, that we had not only cast off all magistrates, but had constituted among ourselves all kinds of magistrates, and were for cutting off all as open enemies who did not acknowledge our imaginary government, that our societies were only an erroneous faction, and have no power of calling pastors, unquote, etc. Which information, so full of calumnies, though they did extenuate, alleging that copy of it which we produced was forged, yet they confessed some such information was written, and went on to prosecute in effect the same crimination, and said they excerpted all out of our public our public papers, and further challenged us for falsely accusing them in our protestation against the Scottish congregation at Rotterdam, where they, with others, were promiscuously charged with sundry things in cumulo, which they were not guilty of. We confessed it was an oversight conjunctly to accumulate these charges without distinction, but taking them separately, we offered to make out everything there charged, upon the names inserted. Furthermore, in inveighing against Mr. Rennick's ordination, they accused the Church of Holland of Erastianism, and of 3 sprinklings in baptism, which they called popish, and some other corruptions, to which he only replied, quote, that he had received his ordination from the presbytery of Groningen, and they, being foreigners, and not chargeable either with our defections, or any declining from the testimony of their own church, but advancing and groaning under some corruptions from which they were never reformed, would come under another consideration for the ministers of our own church, defending a course of defection, unquote. Howbeit, as he protested in the face of their presbytery, when he received ordination against all things that he knew among them dissonant to the Reformation of the Church of Scotland, so he told his purpose to inform that venerable presbytery, quote, how they were represented in Scotland, and if they could not clear themselves at least of some of the grossest of these things, he would be willing to acknowledge before such as were competent that they had offended in meddling with them, unquote.